Did you know that German high school students learn about U.S. propaganda in their English courses in high school?
Yeah, and American history textbooks are straight up propaganda, and I could tell you how they did it. After World War I, the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations didn't want Americans to go back to an anti-war mindset. George Washington had warned Americans to stay out of foreign entanglements in his farewell address. So these foundations attempted to bribe America's 4 leading historians. They got rejected. No problem. They handpicked 20 college students and flew them to London, gave them $400,000 in student grants. Fast forward 10 years, those 20 students made up the governing board of the American Historical Association, who at the time had massive influence over what went into history textbooks, as well as the training that future history teachers would get. And although the agenda might have changed, they've had control of American history textbooks for generations now. It's why I write books on how information is controlled. The congressionally documented history of fake news. Not just our rights, but how they try to manipulate us to take away our rights. How the banking system was corrupted, and much more. ClassicalLearner.com. You know you study a lot of history when you start to study the history of how history is rewritten. And in the 1950s, there were these congressional hearings. The Congressional Reece Committee was put together. And they were basically looking into communism. And they wanted to know if American tax-exempt foundations had been involved in what they termed un-American activities. And there was this guy, Norman Dodd, who was part of the committee, and he was charged with doing the investigation. And the first thing he had to do was, or he decided to do, he said, okay, well, if we're looking into are these tax-exempt foundations involved in un-American activities, we have to define un-American activities. Great lesson for kids, by the way. The defining of terms is so important. You want to teach that from a young age. That's part of a classical education. But he defined un-American activities as any activities designed to effectively alter the policies and laws of the United States of America through unconstitutional means, which I find particularly interesting with everything going on in the modern world, where you have these investment firms. Like right now, we have these investment firms, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, who are involved in this ESG investing, environmental social governance, where they're basically threatening to tank the stocks by pulling our 401k money out of companies if those companies don't go along with what they deem to be socially and environmentally appropriate, which is basically if they're not woke and if they're not Agenda 2030. But they're literally calling it environmental social governance. They're telling you outright that they are attempting to govern the behavior of these companies and thus govern the behavior of us. So back in the 1950s, if Norman Dodd and the Reece Committee had looked into that, they would have said, wait a second, these are un-American activities. I just find that to be fascinating with how overt the corruption is in the modern world. They're openly admitting it right in the name of what they're doing. So you had the 1950s Reece Committee, and they were looking into these tax-exempt foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and Norman Dodd and his secretary, who would lose her mind and eventually commit suicide from what she found during this investigation, because she would tell people and people didn't believe her. People weren't awake like they are now, and she ultimately couldn't handle it. Now, she did not handle it correctly. That is not how you go about it. You know, if you are awake to something and the people around you, everyone in your family, they aren't awake to it, that's okay. You got to take a deep breath and tell yourself that it's okay that they don't think the same thing that you do, and you don't have to try to wake them up every day and scream at the top of the mountain that this is what's going on. You could drop subtle hints, and if they ever wake up to it, great. And if they don't, well, you tried. But you're not going to wake them up by screaming at them. You're not going to wake them up by acting like a crazy person. You just plant seeds, and sometimes seeds break right through concrete. We've all seen it. So you had the Congressional Reese Committee looking into these un-American activities, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Norman Dodd got access to the corporate minutes of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, dating back to, I think, 1908. And they found a few very interesting things. They found that these foundations had colluded to get America into World War I years before America joined. That after the war, they had decided they never wanted Americans to get back to an anti-war mindset. Because if you remember, America originally was isolationist, allegedly. George Washington, in his farewell address, his warning to the American people, by the way, if you ever want to have a great read, go read George Washington's farewell address. It is prophetic to what is happening today. I mean, but that's a side note. But in his farewell address, he warned against getting involved in foreign entanglements. And up until really the Spanish-American War, America and Americans were against getting involved in these foreign entanglements. And that spirit continued to World War I. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president and then would get us into World War I, he ran as, I will be the president that keeps America out of that war in Europe. And that's why he won. People are intrinsically anti-war, and Americans were anti-war up until World War I. So these tax-exempt foundations decide who happen to be the bankers that, the Rockefellers, these are the bankers that fund both sides of these wars. They decide that they don't want Americans to get back to an anti-war mindset. So they determine the best way to do that is through taking over historical textbooks. So first they approach the leading historians of the day and they try to bribe them, and they're turned away. People had integrity, they're turned away. So they say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. They handpick 20 students from across the United States of America, fly them out to London, give them $400,000 in college grants. Well, fast forward 10 years, and those students make up the governing board of the American Historical Association, who at the time had tremendous influence over best practices as it relates to what goes into history textbooks and the training that future history teachers will receive. They took over the textbooks. By the way, if you look how they took over the medical system, they used the American Medical Association to take over college accreditations, right? And they trained the way future doctors, they altered the way, took over the way that future doctors would be trained. So this is a modus apparatus. This is a strategy that these tax-exempt foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, that they use, right? So they took over history textbooks, and now generations of Americans have been taught. The agenda might change, right? Like now they want to teach this or that, but generations of Americans have been propagandized by these textbooks that have an agenda behind them. And if you want to learn more about that, by the way, you can go type in Norman Dodd interview with G. Edward Griffin. It's a fascinating interview. The life of Norman Dodd. He was a really interesting man who contributed a lot to the world. And of course, they smeared him. They called him You know what? You guys get it. Got to be careful with your words here. Got the algorithms. But really interesting interview, really interesting guy. So, by the way, may I just say, because I get these comments. I get these comments on TikTok and Instagram. Oh, so you think Germany doesn't propagandize their people? It's not a false binary, right? It's not like, oh, America propagandizes their people, so Germany doesn't propagandize. That's not how it works. That's a false binary. It's a black and white. It's a logical fallacy. It's why we teach kids the logical fallacies. They're both doing it. Just because I go on a rant where I talk about the corruption of American propaganda, yeah, I'm American. I teach American students. I live in America. That's what I'm going to talk about. Obviously, Germany propagandizes their people. I mean, they've taught them to hate their own history. And we can get into that history another day. But they are some of the most propagandized people in the entire world. So, yes, I'm aware of that. But what I'm focused on is how our children are propagandized. And to me, as a parent, it's important that we teach our children to identify propaganda as early as possible. Now, you have to be subtle how you do that. Do not show your young child the horror of the world. Young children have this beautiful innocence, and you want to preserve that for as long as humanly possible. Preserve their innocence. But at the same time, teach them about the world. Here's an example, one way you can do that, practical application. Sit down with your kid and watch a Sarah McLachlan commercial. In the arms of the angel. You didn't know I was going to sing to you, did you? A Sarah McLachlan commercial. She's sitting down. They're playing the sad music. They have the sad-looking puppy. She's petting it. They're showing you images of puppies that are malnourished in cages. There's flies around them. There's flies flying on their face. It's a terrible situation. Sit down and watch that commercial with your child and then break it down. What is the goal of the commercial? What are they trying to get from you? They're trying to get, for 5 pennies a day, right? They're trying to get money from you. How are they going about doing that? How did the images of the sad puppy make you feel? Why is a puppy in particular something that invokes emotion in you? And you want to get to its vulnerability. Just like when they want to start wars, they use children, or they say that children are being attacked, so we need to go to war with so-and-so. This is a common tactic of propagandists. We've seen this in Syria. We've seen this in Iraq and Kuwait, right? We've seen this very recently. I'm not going to get into with what, but you know what we just saw this with. So, got to talk around the algorithms a little bit here, but we don't just say we just saw it taking place in the Middle East. That's what I'm trying to get at. But, so this is a common tactic, and we want to teach our children about this tactic in a way that's not scary. You're not showing them the horror of the world. You're just teaching them to identify it. How did the music make you feel? Did the music affect your emotions? Did the music make you feel a certain way for the dog? And did that feeling make you more likely to take action, right? It's a simple and easy way to introduce young children to propaganda. I mean, this is what I do, right? I teach young people about propaganda. This is the Cubs to Bears children books. Yes, it's about how information is controlled, right? Free speech, social media, beep, and the First Amendment. Yes, it's about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Yes, it's about the congressionally documented history of fake news, Operation Mockingbird. But Cubs to Bears, what I'm doing is I'm actually demonstrating to children in the book propaganda. They're seeing how the animals are propagandized and how the bears are calling it out, and they're actually becoming familiar with that propaganda. One of the things I do right now is I have been writing a fake newspaper, the Daily Cat, 2 fake newspapers, the Daily Cat and the Bear Standard. So I actually write these fake newspapers, and we go over the newspapers and we go over the propaganda, and I'll talk about that another day. But I'm going to wrap this video up now. I think this was a good talk, but we got to handle what I got to handle. So share, like, comment. It helps my algorithm. It helps me grow if you believe in my message. And www.classicallearner.com.